Good morning, Canada. Well, protests are still on. The bridge is open. There are more committees going on today than normal. That is for certain. There's 15 meetings today. And basically everything's on fire. Finance is going on. We have ethics. We have the capping of natural resources emissions. Basically, we got it all.
That when we come to it. So go ahead, Mr. Kurek. You were first with 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And first, let me thank the witnesses for coming and sharing your expertise with us. It's very, very appreciated. Dr. Lyon, I noted that you started off your opening statement by talking about the definition of surveillance, and that was in stark contrast, quite frankly, to what Minister Duclos shared with this committee, and has been largely, but your comments seem to be consistent with some of the other experts that we've heard. Can you comment further on your feelings as to what Minister Duclos said before this committee, suggesting that surveillance was not involved?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I say, the problem is that surveillance is heard in many different ways. So you have that common kind of public notion of surveillance as having to do with the ways in which police, say, would seek out or keep watch over some suspect, or equally intelligence services might do the same sort of thing. And so that obviously requires identifiable information to be used for that kind of surveillance, and that is a form of surveillance. But as I also pointed out, the Public Health Agency of Canada does surveillance too. They are doing public health surveillance. They're using the large data sets, as we've heard, and that too is surveillance. And so my argument would be that we need to broaden our definition of surveillance to include such things. So the definition that I was using, any focused, systematic, and routine attention to personal details for the sake of some purpose, such as influence or management, control, or protection. That serves as a definition that covers all the range of surveillance activities that we see today. And increasingly, of course, the move, as both of my other colleagues have commented, over the last few decades is to be using larger and larger data sets covering larger and larger groups in the population. And surveillance is being done at different levels. But my point really was that at whatever level, there needs to be very serious concern and specific regulatory changes to keep up with the changes in technology that allow for these different sorts of surveillance.
Thank you for that, Dr. Lyon. Now, in an article you had shared comments with that was published in the National Post, you made some comparisons about some of the surveillance that was done post 9/11 with some of the surveillance that's been done over the course of COVID. And this really becomes a question of the mass scale to which data has been used for Canada's public health response. So I'm curious, Dr. Lyon, and I'll try to ask a couple of other witnesses as well. Does the large scale of PHAC's program have raised concerns with you?
The large scale. Well, as all three of today's witnesses pointed out, what is the intentions of public health surveillance are ones that I think that we would all agree with, that they are trying very hard to track what is happening within the pandemic, to see where the virus is spreading in geographical areas and within which population groups, and so on and so forth. It's a very important task, but the fact that it's an important task doesn't reduce the fact that there are risks entailed in it at every stage, from data collection through to data analysis, through to the actual use, the interpretation and use of those data. So at every point, there are difficulties. So what I don't think we should be underestimating is the character of those difficulties. And those difficulties also, rather like the simpler sense of surveillance as watching a suspect, for example, involve harms. There are harms at the individual level, but there may also be harms at the group level, questions of equity, questions of justice, questions of how a group is characterized, and so on and so forth. So the question of the scale really just requires that we look at the issues of scale with a view to their being understood and regulated appropriately.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lyon. And a question for both you, and if I could maybe have Dr. Marconi Wood, if I'm saying that correctly. Do you feel that the safeguards and frameworks have been adequately shared with the Canadian public to be confident that their data is using correctly? I'm hoping to get both of your responses, so they'll have to be really, really quick. Do you feel that those safeguards and frameworks have been adequately disclosed to the Canadian public? Dr. Wood, if you could.
Simply put, no. I agree that most of this data was probably necessary and was important to be used for public health, but at the same time, no. The safeguards have not been made public or accessible in an adequate way.
Oh. No, and I appreciate that. Could I just get a quick comment from the other two witnesses? Is there?
I agree with Dr. Murakami Wood's view.
Okay.
Also, no information is currently available to make clear how data is safeguarded and the efficacy of the data.
I hate to do it, but we really got to keep moving, and there were only a few seconds left.
Going on, later on today, we have Afghanistan. Helping the survivors of that turmoil, that fall, and the Straits of Taiwan. What's going on in the Straits of Taiwan? Well, you're gonna have to check out the highlights.
To Ms. Sachs for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses who have joined us today. Your opening statements were quite helpful in shaping our discussion today. I'd like to just start with perhaps with Dr. David Murakami Wood. Witnesses in previous sessions that we've had, as well as expressions today, have been about understanding that how important data is for creating evidence-based policy when it comes to public health, particularly in the pandemic that we're in. And I agree with you. This is in some ways a dry run and a learning curve for many experts, not just here in Canada, but throughout the world. We've seen countries and municipalities, provinces trying to navigate this pandemic with deficits in data and trying to shore that up in working with good data sets such as TELUS Data for Good. And we know from PHAC that they've used this data at the federal level. We also know countries like Australia, Spain, Germany, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and so on. The list goes on and on. But Dr. Murakami Wood, in your opening statements, you said that evidence-based policy needs data sets, and it can be a good thing, and that in this particular case, you felt there was no suspicion of individual surveillance. Could you firstly talk about the importance of a data-driven approach and where your comments came of there's been concerns about can depersonalized aggregated data be repersonalized, but your comments seem to indicate that in the TELUS for Good data that wasn't the case.
Yeah, thank you for your question. My comments really here relate to the increasing need for good quality data to produce policy that's effective. And we've seen whether it comes from open source data, industry data, or whether it's data that's generated through specific research in which many of us academics are involved in, this data is increasingly necessary on which to build public policy. You'll recall that we had similar arguments around good quality data sets a decade ago in the arguments about the public long form census. And on that occasion, while there were arguments being made about privacy and so on, most of us in the academic world were actually on the other side of the debate and arguing in favor of the long-form census because it provided important data which allowed us to make effective social policy. And that's the kind of, I think, the importance of this sort of data set. But as David Lyon said earlier, it does not mean there are not risks. And it does not mean that data can just be used in any way that the government sees fit to use it. It does not mean that the government does not have to account for data and how it is used or provide evidence, as Dr. Parsons has said, of consent. So I think those things are all very important. The final thing I didn't get to in my opening statement, which is absolutely vital, is to expand on what Professor Lyons said about group harms. One of the key things about large data sets is that hidden within these data sets are existing forms of bias and prejudice. I'll give you an example. Say in this TELUS data for good, this is just made up, by the way, that it was found that people in a particular suburb of Toronto were traveling further distances more often than other people in Toronto. And, if you could easily assume from this data that these people were spreading the virus or were disobeying government instructions on travel. But in fact, if you look into this particular suburb, you find it's a low-income place, largely Black and ethnic minority. And what you've got in this area is people who have to travel to get to warehousing jobs or work in the gig economy. And the reason they're mobile and moving more often is precisely because they're underprivileged. And therefore, to stigmatize these people or to blame them for the virus spread would be to misread the social facts on the ground. So that's just one notional example, but it's very important, therefore, to be able to understand not just the data as facts, but the data as its social context and in its social context. So that's what I think is really vital when we talk about large data sets.
I do appreciate that.
Used.
Thank you. And we have seen from the assessments that have been reviewed that we've been able to pinpoint where more information for public health agencies, both municipally and federally, we're able to help communities that were struggling based on that kind of data. So there's I think there's two sides to the coin of that kind of useful data when it comes to particular demographic sets. I'd like to move on to Dr. Dr. Lyons, if I may. In this world that we're in of anonymized data, would you be able to comment if can we have perfect anonymity? Is it even possible? We know the value of this data and what needs to be collected, but at the same time, there's much discussion about the safeguard rails that need to be put in place or that we're discussing here, but can we reach that perfect anonymity in having useful data?
As I said, I'm not a technical expert, but it does seem to me that from the evidence that such a notion is very, very hard to actually obtain in practice. So, there are ways of taking care and taking more care with data analysis, especially. And don't forget, I mentioned each of the stages. It's not only the collection, the gathering of those data in the first place. The analysis is critical. And within those forms of analysis, anonymity may also be compromised, right through to the uses of those data. So I have great doubts that there is a real sense of anonymous data.
So then PHAC's statement that
is,
it did not...
you're out of time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Conservative MP Stewart, and then Dzerowicz we have coming up in the Finance Committee, and they're investigating on what's going to be going on in the next budget. So check this out. Where's the money going?
We don't have the same gap as we had the last round. Mr. Baylor, can you give can you answer yes or no? Can you say with certainty that all farmers will receive at least 90% of their carbon tax back in this rebate?
Well, to be clear, the rebate is apportioning based on the expenses and the idea there.
Thank you, Mr. Baylor. So that's no. How about, can you say that all farmers will receive at least 50% of the carbon tax they paid back? Yes or no?
As we've discussed, in terms of how much they're getting back in terms of what they pay, that would be tabulated.
So you can't say today, even though you're in front of a parliamentary committee.
Mr. Chair? Point of order, Madame Chatel.
Yeah.
Point of order. There's a point of order. Yeah, Madame Chatel.
It is hard for translation when you, so thank you.
Yeah, so members, and I say more to the members than the official, but the crosstalk does affect the interpreters. They request that we don't have that crosstalk.
I apologize, and I respect that. So last question then, Mr. Baylor. Can you say with certainty that 100% of farmers or all farmers will receive at least 10% of their carbon tax back in the form of this rebate?
I believe my colleague, Mr. King, may have those numbers in terms of how much they pay under the fuel charge and then how much they receive through the tax credit. If not, then I won't. I do not have them at this point.
Thank you. I'll give my time over then to Mr. Stewart, and just to confirm, you can't even say with certainty that farmers will receive 10% of their carbon tax rebate back.
Well,
thank you.
That's because that's not something I was looking at. Like I said, my colleague, Mr. King, would have looked at that.
Yeah, my first question is through the chair. We've already established that we can't. Officials aren't willing to speak about whether or not health transfers was ever discussed in the $70 billion in new spending, despite economists calling for no economic stimulus spending, and any money spent should be on health care transfers, according to economists. So today in the House of Commons, but for myself here in committee on the voting app, going to be voting to have the government place and table a plan to live with COVID, to end the mandates. The government is asking for more new money for proof of vaccination initiatives. I'll read it to you here. It says, Part 5 authorizes payments to be made out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the purpose of supporting coronavirus disease 2019, COVID-19, proof of vaccination initiatives. So can someone please tell me where this directive is coming from? Because 2/3 of Canadians want an end to vaccine passports. They felt that the overarching and the reach of government was really intrusive over the last couple of years. So I'm wondering why we're spending taxpayer dollars in the billions to increase vaccine passports and the measures surrounding them. Thank you.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Madame Chatel.
Yeah, these are official from the government. They're not political people. So I would remind my colleague, Mr. Stewart, if he has political question, please ask minister, member of government, but not official.
Thank you, Madame Chatel. Yes, these are officials. They are not here to answer political questions.
So yes or no, is this bill investing billions of dollars into increasing vaccine passports?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Perhaps if I could clarify one point. Over the past year, the Government of Canada and provinces and territories have worked together on a standardized proof of vaccination credential, recognizing the need for citizens and residents to have access to a secure and verifiable document for both domestic and international travel. And we've collaborated over the last year to develop a standard using the Smart Health Application Standard. The purpose of this fund is to compensate provinces and territories for the costs of establishing the proof of vaccination credential programs, for the issuance of proof of vaccination credentials, and for maintaining the program for as long as it's required, either domestically or for international travel.
Said, oh, it's just inflation. Said, oh, it's just inflation. Oh, it's just inflation. Well, it's not just inflation, Mr. Speaker. It is a focus to reach all members in this House to support its speedy passage. Yes. The Honourable Member for Carleton.
The Minister's response was just incredible. He said, even after how just incredible.
Said, oh, it's just inflation.
just incredible.
Thank you, MP Stewart. That is the time. We are moving to MP Dzerowicz for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And maybe just I'll start off by indicating just to Mr. Stewart's sort of queries around sort of the vaccine mandates and, what's behind that logic. I know that there was a recent poll that was done, and Eric Grenier sort of announced this on Twitter. He says, I've seen lots of references to the Angus Reid Institute poll that suggests a majority want to end restrictions and let people self-isolate if they're at risk, whatever that means. Leger's more straightforward question still shows that the majority don't want to lift restrictions. So I'll leave it with that, with a statement. I then want to turn my attention to small businesses. As we all know, they are the heart and soul of our economy. And I had a chance to visit many of our small businesses across the Davenport riding over Saturday, and a big shout out to Green Jar and African Palace and Caribbean Queen, amazing businesses. And I think they're going to be very happy to learn that C8 includes a small business air quality improvement tax credit, where there would be a temporary refundable 25% tax credit for eligible businesses on expenses, excuse me, incurred to undertake air quality improvements that increase outdoor air intake or air cleaning in commercial properties. And I think it's on everybody's minds as we're trying to get into the post-COVID economy world. How is it that we can continue to keep our staff safe and to keep our customers safe? Can officials maybe comment on how this new fund will work? So how is it that small businesses will be able to access this tax credit?
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. Chair, I can comment on that. It's not a fund per se, of course. It's something that the businesses, and when they make an eligible expense, in this case, in terms of purchasing eligible HVAC systems or HEPA filters, they can then claim that expense as a credit against their tax payable through their tax return, and of course, because it's refundable, if they happen to not owe tax in that year, well, then they would receive the funds through the refundability aspect.
Thank you so much. The second, one of the other things that C8 includes is an extension of the repayment of the Canada Emergency Business Account. So CEBA, as it is known, has provided $49 billion in interest-free, partially forgivable loans to nearly 900,000 small businesses affected by the pandemic. Many across my riding, I'm sure all of our ridings right across this country. And so C8 would actually extend the repayment deadline and offer partial loan forgiveness for those who repay before 2024. Is there an official that can talk to the impact that this extension will have and what would occur if we did not extend this repayment deadline?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can answer that question. So the Bill C8 proposes actually setting the limitation period for CEBA loans. Is to support the extension, but not explicitly for the extension that was announced on January 12th for CEBA repayment. The provision in the bill proposed to set limitation period of 6 years for all CEBA loan holders, and doing so would ensure that no matter where CEBA loan holders live in this country, they will be able, the government can treat them consistently, and that the government would have the ability to provide leniencies for businesses that may be facing financial challenges to repay the CEBA loans.
Well, I appreciate you mentioning that, and I think that part of the extension of your response is the fact that it'll take some time for some of our businesses to get back on track, and it gives them more chance to remain viable. And so appreciate the response and appreciate your work. If I have time for one more question, Mr. Chair.
30 seconds.
Well, my question is around the $100 million top-up Safe Return to Class Fund. So 18 schools in Davenport have benefited from the original $2 billion fund. I wonder if in more concrete terms, officials can indicate how would a school be able to access this fund through dollars sent down to the provinces?
So the funding is transferred to provinces and territories, and each province and territory determines how the funding will flow to various school boards and therefore down to each individual school.